The past 5 years have been turbulent. For a young man like myself, many of these things is the first time experiencing what we've experienced. And we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic happen. We've seen climate shocks happen. Now we've seen the political destabilization globally that has affected supply chains. And that has led to a lot of inflationary pressures. And I'm going to put you in the hot seat. I'm just piggybacking off the IMF director's words, Mr. Maxwell. The role of the Central Bank of Ghana, right, the past few years have been challenging in one way or the other, but then that has led to it evolving. Could you break it down for us in terms of what is the functionality of the Central Bank of Ghana and how is that different from maybe other central banks, and how has that evolved over the last 5 to 6 years?
Thank you very much, and let me take this opportunity to also congratulate National Bank of Rwanda on the 60th anniversary celebration. I have a very close link with National Bank of Rwanda. It was my first country assignment when I joined the IMF, so I feel very particularly attached to National Bank of Rwanda. But then coming to the very difficult question. I think everybody who is following developments in Africa, especially on economic development, knows about Ghana and the challenges Ghana has gone through. The mandate and the function of the Central Bank of Ghana is the same as all other central banks. Our primary mandate is price stability. We also are required to promote financial stability. But then there is a conflict. This is in the Bank of Ghana Act. Then when you go into the Constitution, it says that you should support economic growth and development. And so the government and the parliamentarians, they are looking at the Constitution, which sets out the role of the central bank. And then you have an act, and the lawyers will tell you when you have an act and the Constitution, which one is superior. So that alone sets the tone for the tension in terms of expectation. But the central bank has been guided by the act for a long period of time. We have operational independence enshrined in the act, which is very clear to say that nothing should limit us or make it difficult for us to achieve our primary mandate. So we followed that consistently, but the last 5 years has been difficult. And I think I'll start from 2020. But prior to 2020, Ghana was really doing very well. Inflation, for the first time in a long time, has been in single digit consistently for a long period of time. Growth was up. Currency depreciation has been very low and stable. And so things were doing very well. That's up to 2019. 2020 comes with unique circumstances. It came with COVID, but something that people don't also know is that it's also the election year. And normally, if you follow Ghana, every election year comes with fiscal slippages. So if you combine the election year and the government's decision to protect lives and livelihood at all costs during the COVID and put that together, you realize that Ghana emerged out of the COVID in 2021 with huge fiscal slippage, which also exposed our debt vulnerability. Prior to that, we were high risk of debt distress. By the time we emerged out of COVID, we were debt distress, not high risk anymore. You've moved from the risk to actual debt distress, and it's because of the fiscal slippage during that time. I'm saying all this because that is where the problem started. And the 2021 budget was supposed to address and reverse the policies in 2020 to bring back fiscal correction. It did not do so. So early 2022, Ghana was blocked from the international capital markets because we were downgraded. Meanwhile, Ghana has consistently borrowed $3 billion every year to close the financing gap from the international capital market. That alone is a squeeze externally. Then the domestic market also started facing auction failures. So that was also a squeeze domestically. So government, interest payments, domestic and external amortization, combined with total compensation of public sector, exceeded 100% of total revenue. If you don't have external financing, if you don't have domestic financing, and you exceed total, you can't even pay public sector workers, and you have a country in 2022, what do? The Central Bank Act says that the central bank can finance government budget 5% of the previous year's revenue. But we have our own MOU with the Ministry of Finance, and we place it at 0. So between 2017 and 2019, there was 0 central bank financing, irrespective of the 5%. 2020, because of COVID, we triggered an act to finance government. 2021, we returned to 0 central bank financing. So central bank had been operating prudently. Then you come 2022, government cannot pay public sector workers, cannot pay the police, cannot pay the military. There is coup d'etat all around Ghana, and there is social strife. People are going on the street. Fuel prices escalated, and the central bank is sitting down there, and the central bank says that there is no central bank financing, so you close your arms and you sit down. That was a difficult policy challenge and difficult environment for any central bank to face. What do? The jury is still out there. But then the Act, Section 30 of our Act says that in times of crisis, you can trigger Section 30 of our Act, and the governor and the minister will sit together and agree on a new limit of financing of government and present that to Parliament. And that's precisely what the central bank did. When that happened, and we did that, as Abebe said, huge central bank financing, it came with high inflation, high exchange rate passed through, the currency was depreciating. Inflation went all the way from an average of 7.9% to 54%. The currency depreciated by 30%. Debt was in distress. You don't have any fiscal space because debt payment and compensation exceeded 100% of total revenue. We went to the IMF. IMF cannot lend into debt distress. So the first thing you have to do is to reduce your debt. And so you realize that the biggest policy decision was debt exchange and debt restructuring, because you cannot do that only through fiscal policy or fiscal consolidation. Here you needed a stock adjustment to be able to reduce and create space. So we had to go through that restructuring. It has been painful domestically, but as I was telling others over the coffee break, we are beginning to see Ghana moving in the right direction now. Inflation has come down close to 22%, 23%. The growth has bounced back again. Fiscal is consolidating. The currency has been relatively stable with episodes of high depreciation, but that is more manageable than what we saw in 2022. So that has been the difficult policy challenge facing the central bank. And the central bank has come under a lot of attack. Social attack from parliamentarians, people demonstrating against the central bank, because by doing that, we saw our balance sheet going into losses and negative equity. So this is the context within which the Bank of Ghana has been operating in the last 5 years. I think I'll stop here. We'll have follow-up questions.
Thank you very much, Deputy Governor. It's another election year, so we'll be coming back to you to see where we are headed. I'd like to bring the Deputy Governor for the Bank of Uganda into the conversation, Dr. Michael. Uganda has had a very unique approach to curbing inflation, and this is since about 2011. The monetary policy framework there, you went towards something called inflation target light. And the Ugandan shilling has been one of the better performing currencies, maybe one-eyed among the blind, as some will say. Take us through that policy framework and how it has enabled you to curb inflation in Uganda.
Okay, thank you so much, Anur. I think taking through the policy framework, I will just use the most recent examples of it. I think maybe let me just back down here. First, I want to congratulate the National Bank of Rwanda on this 60th anniversary. Like Maxwell said, I have a strong association with the National Bank of Rwanda. One of my last assignments was I was a country reviewer for Rwanda. I remember when I was about to leave the IMF, it was the last country I visited as a reviewer. So that's why I'm fond of Rwanda. Now, back to your question. In answering your question, I will use the most recent experience in terms of inflation to explain how this monetary policy framework has helped us. In 2022, we had the country closed under the COVID-19 lockdown for a long time, including schools. Now, Uganda is on record as being one of those countries that has closed schools for almost 2 years. Now, you reopened the schools. So we saw the first bout of inflation coming from the services inflation as a result of the reopening of schools. And then, of course, we were hit with the Russia-Ukraine crisis that led to the commodity prices going up. And then that very year also again, we saw a significant outflow of capital from Uganda because of what the advanced economies were doing to control inflation. So there was a flight back to the safe havens. And we were hit with a strong depreciation in the currency. And the same year again, we were hit with an extended drought. So what did this policy framework do? The beauty about this policy framework is that it is forward-looking. So you can take the actions of today and read 12 months down the road, 18 months down the road. That is your transmission mechanism. When you take an action today, how is it going to impact whatever inflation is going to be? But to know what inflation is going to be in 12 to 18 months down the road, you need to forecast that inflation, you need to model that inflation as a result of today's developments and any other thing that's going to happen in between. So you come up with your inflation outlook. And since you know the transmission lag, you can take a policy action today to affect the inflation outlook. And given that lag, which is about 12 to 18 months, coinciding with the outlook as well, the actions you take today will have an impact on inflation around that time. So because we've been applying that framework consistently, we know our inflation target is about 5%. So whenever something happens today, where the outlook is suggesting that it's going to be more than 5%, we are forced to trigger an action today, a policy action today, to bring down the outlook to where we want it to be. So it's been very, very helpful for us in terms of containing inflation where you want it to be. But most importantly, you need to allow the flexibility in the exchange rate. If the exchange rate is not stable, is not flexible, it becomes difficult to conduct that framework. But of course, you also know the challenges of having a flexible exchange rate in a situation where you have capital flows in and out. The market is sensitive to any piece of information, the exchange rate moves the other way around. So what does that call? It calls for a consistent and a persistent application of the correct monetary policies. Because absent that, you will suffer the casualty of failing to meet your inflation target because the exchange rate has gone south. So it means that you need to allow the flexibility. Like Abebe was saying, there's a fear of floating initially, but once you allow the exchange rate to be market determined, that fear of floating will reduce as long as you apply the correct policies. So that's how we've been able to keep inflation constant. Others are saying that, look, Uganda is able to maintain a low inflation because you don't import food. But the issue is, in 2022, we had a very severe drought where annual inflation food crop inflation went up to about 32%, but we still kept inflation around 9%. So it means that whether inflation is a supply side thing or not, as long as inflation is defined by the fact that it's a generalized rise in the prices in the economy, irrespective of where the source of that inflation is coming from, as a central bank, you need to be mindful of that. So what we were able to do in that kind of situation was to look at the path-through from the supply side to these other prices in the consumer price index basket. So once you see that begin to pass through, that's when you trigger monetary policy actions. And that's exactly what we did with the supply side challenges we faced in 2022. We were able to nip them early enough by taking aggressive monetary policy stance as guided by the framework. So in a period of 3 months, we raised the policy rate by 350 basis points. We increased the cash reserve no requirements by 200 basis points. That had the impact of squeezing aggregate demand and checking the depreciation of the currency. And that's why the exchange rate has been very stable and inflation has been kept low.
Thank you, Dr. Ting. I want to bring the governor of Bissau into the conversation, Mr. Jean-Claude Akasi. Yours is a rather very unique situation. It's a monetary union. You oversee quite a few countries within the West African bloc, so different from Ghana and Uganda, but also there are challenges there. Before we dive into the challenges, how does the monetary union, the Bissau monetary union, work?
Bien, merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en français. Oui. D'abord, je voudrais remercier le gouverneur de la Banque du Rwanda, la Banque nationale du Rwanda, John Rangwamba, pour notre invitation à participer à cette cérémonie, je dirais, de festivité, parce que vraiment, je voudrais féliciter pour les 60 ans. 60 ans, c'est de la maturité, c'est de l'expérience. C'est des progrès qui ont été accomplis et on l'a vu dans le film, on l'a vu dans l'intervention. Je voudrais vraiment les féliciter pour tout ce qui a été fait. Hier, j'ai eu le privilège, puisque c'est pratiquement ma première visite ici, de faire un tour de la ville. Et j'ai été très, très, très impressionné par ce que j'ai vu. En tout cas, vraiment, félicitations et joyeux anniversaire. Alors, la question, évidemment, qui est évoquée, c'est vrai, l'Union monétaire ouest-africaine, bon, j'ai écouté mes frères du Ghana et de l'Ouganda, notre organisation est légèrement différente. C'est une union monétaire de 8 pays. Des pays qui sont quand même différents, puisque le plus riche a un PIB par tête de près de $2 800, le moins riche a un PIB d'autour de $500 PIB par tête. Donc il y a quand même une différence. Mais une union monétaire avec une monnaie commune, une banque centrale commune, une loi bancaire unique pour les 8 pays, un marché financier unique. Et fondamentalement, un taux de change fixe avec l'euro. Donc différent de ce que mes deux prédécesseurs ont évoqué. Mais cet arrangement fixe du taux de change nous a apporté beaucoup d'éléments positifs parce que ça nous a permis vraiment d'atteindre un de nos objectifs, c'est-à-dire la stabilité pratiquement monétaire. Donc je vais revenir un peu là-dessus. Mais je dois dire que pour répondre précisément à votre question, une des particularités de notre union monétaire, comme toute union monétaire, c'est fondé sur 2 principes fondamentaux. Le premier principe, c'est la solidarité. Et cette solidarité, elle se manifeste essentiellement à 2 niveaux. Le premier niveau, c'est que nous avons une mutualisation des réserves de change. Toutes les réserves de change générées par les 8 pays sont mises dans un pot commun. Et quand un pays a besoin de réserves de change pour financer ses importations, pour payer sa dette, pour tous ses paiements extérieurs, il puise dans le pot commun. L'avantage, c'est que quand un pays a un choc de balance de paiement, fait face à des difficultés, d'instabilité interne, de baisse du prix de ses exportations, il continue à mobiliser les ressources du pot commun sur les réserves. Et donc ça apporte beaucoup de stabilité pour le pays en lui-même. Le deuxième élément que ce système apporte dans cette solidarité, c'est que les pays ont accès au marché financier régional. Une banque dans un pays donné mobilise des ressources, pas seulement sur son marché, mais sur le marché des 8 pays. Donc ça lui offre beaucoup d'opportunités. Et vous avez des banques dans un pays X qui détiennent des titres publics de tous les autres pays. Et donc, ça augmente la solidarité. Et je crois que ce sont deux caractéristiques, à mon sens, importantes et qui expliquent beaucoup de choses que nous avons observées dans notre Union. Le deuxième élément, qui est également important, c'est que, en plus de la solidarité, l'Union monétaire apporte beaucoup en matière de concertation, de coordination. Parce qu'il n'est pas possible d'avoir une union monétaire sans coordination, sans concertation. Et 61 années, parce que nous avons fêté notre 60e anniversaire il y a 2 ans, 61 années de concertation régulière, c'est-à-dire des rencontres de 8 ministres chaque trimestre avec le gouverneur de la Banque centrale pour discuter de coordination, ça a créé des mécanismes de concertation qui sont très bien huilés, qui sont extrêmement importants pour atteindre les objectifs de la Banque centrale. Les objectifs, stabilité des prix, stabilité financière, et récemment, nous avons inclus les questions liées à l'inclusion financière. Quand on parle un peu de nos objectifs, comment on a réalisé ces objectifs, comment on les réalise, comme toutes les banques centrales, nous avons été affectés par les chocs, les mêmes chocs. On a eu le choc de la Covid. Avant la Covid, on avait une inflation qui tournait autour de 1-2%, avec des réserves de change confortables et une croissance bien soutenue. Avec la Covid, comme dans tous les pays, il y a eu des restrictions très fortes. Et donc, nous avons adapté nos instruments. Nous avons donné de la liquidité aux banques, baissé les taux directeurs. Nous avons facilité l'émission de bons et d'obligations pour les trésors, qui ont permis donc d'injecter de manière importante de la liquidité pour accompagner les pays. Et ça a été la période 2020 jusqu'à fin 2020. 2021. Et à partir de fin 2021, lorsque l'inflation mondiale a commencé à augmenter, nous importons, donc nous avons connu une hausse des prix. Et en 2022, nous avons atteint pratiquement un taux de 9% de l'inflation, ce qui était pratiquement 3 fois notre cible. Et donc, nous sommes revenus sur notre stratégie. Nous avons arrêté d'abord, nous avons augmenté les taux directeurs à plusieurs reprises, de 150 points de base pratiquement. Nous avons revu à la baisse les allocations qui avaient été mises en place en matière de liquidité pour soutenir les États. Et nous avons effectivement introduit donc d'autres mesures donc pour restreindre un peu la demande intérieure. Et donc nous avons vu progressivement l'inflation baisser. En 2022 surtout, 2022-2023, nous avons connu une situation un peu similaire à ce qui a été indiqué. Avec la hausse des taux d'intérêt internationaux, les pays qui mobilisaient sur le marché international des eurobonds n'ont pas pu le faire. En 2022-2023, zéro, aucune mobilisation. Donc, difficulté de financement. Tous les États se sont retournés vers le marché financier. On a vu les taux sur les marchés financiers, les taux sur les bons du Trésor, les obligations du Trésor. Les taux sur les bons ont augmenté pratiquement de 400 points de base. Et sur les obligations, on est monté jusqu'à 500 points de base. Et donc, nous avons dû intervenir parce qu'il y avait une pression sur le marché financier régional. Et donc, nous avons réinjecté de la liquidité. Et aujourd'hui, dans la situation 2024, début 2024, nous avons eu un comité de politique monétaire en début de semaine. Aujourd'hui, l'inflation est revenue pratiquement dans la cible. Nous sommes à 2,8%, donc en deçà de notre cible de 3%. Nos réserves de change, qui avaient été sous pression avec la période 2022-2023, lorsque les marchés étaient fermés, internationaux, nos réserves de change ont commencé à se reconstituer, puisque certains pays sont retournés sur les marchés internationaux. La croissance est revenu à son niveau avant la Covid. Nous sommes à une moyenne de 5-6% pratiquement. Et en 2024, on atteint une croissance de 6%. Donc globalement, le défi que nous avons eu, vraiment, ça a été, en même temps que nous étions en train de lutter contre l'inflation par une réduction donc, de la liquidité, la hausse de nos taux d'intérêt, en même temps, les pressions donc, sur le marché ont fait que nous devions à un moment donné, pour éviter une instabilité sur les marchés financiers régionaux, injecter. Donc ça a été un dilemme. Mais je pense que l'élément clé également, ça a été quand même la coordination, comme j'ai évoqué, parce que nous allons en fait au-delà d'une union monétaire. Nous avons une union économique, donc nous avons un pacte de convergence donc qui limite le déficit budgétaire à un taux de 3%, limite l'endettement à 70%. Et donc, ce pacte qui avait été suspendu avec la Covid, donc il est aujourd'hui en train d'être mis en place, mais il a été indiqué clairement la nécessité de réduire les déficits, de converger. Et la leçon qu'on peut tirer, c'est que quand nous avons des chocs multiples que nous avons connus, des chocs extérieurs et des chocs internes, nous avons les problèmes de sécurité dans le Sahel en particulier, la politique monétaire toute seule ne peut pas régler tous les problèmes. Il faut bien sûr une politique monétaire qui s'adapte, qui adapte par rapport à ses objectifs, mais il faut que les autres instruments économiques jouent. La politique budgétaire, les politiques économiques qui sont mises en place doivent accompagner tous dans la même direction pour atteindre les objectifs de prix, stabilité financière et croissance économique. Je crois que c'est la leçon que nous pouvons tirer de la situation que nous avons vécue au cours des 3 dernières années. Et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, comme je l'ai dit, les choses reviennent à la normale et nous sommes sur de meilleures bases pour pouvoir vraiment envisager le futur proche sous de meilleurs auspices. Voilà, je voudrais m'arrêter là pour ce moment. Merci.
We got everything there. I'd like to bring Dr. Donald Kaberuka into the conversation, and the previous 3 governors have spoken from a central bank monetary union perspective. Thank you. Bring Dr. Donald Kaberuka into the conversation. Now, the previous speakers have spoken from a central banker's perspective. You yourself are not a central banker, so I want you to speak from maybe a macro perspective in a way regarding the current roles of central banks as they are on the continent, and your personal assessment of maybe how could they perform differently, or what could they do differently to ensure that Africa continues to develop at the pace at which it's growing.
Thank you. Good morning. You know, before you came here, I asked this gentleman, what am I doing here? I'm not a central banker. I don't do monetary policy. So it's like you're being asked to go to sell ice in Antarctica with all these central bankers and IMF people. I was not sure how I'm going to add value. But I want to begin by thanking our colleagues for coming to Rwanda and for what you do in your different countries. Your job is not easy. There's a former vice of the Federal Reserve who said the role of central banks is to worry. And I want to say that you have done a very good job under very difficult circumstances. So I want to give you my commendation. Now, for our own central bank, what can I say? I want to say here, is the only Rwandan on this panel, it's one of the institutions for which we are very proud. The role of central banks is never easy. You have to navigate conflicting goals. You're called upon to evolve, and the rest of it. But I think this central bank has done what it's supposed to do. Flexibly, focusing on core mandates, but being aware of the broader issues in the economy. And here, well, I might be selling ice to Antarctica, that's fine. There may be a buyer one day there. But Jean-Claude has made my life easy. My life very easy. So, I was finance minister when the government asked me to take to parliament the law giving the Central Bank of Rwanda full independence. To be honest with you, it was a tough decision by government, but it was a necessary decision. Many people in this room, I used to tell Gordon Brown, who is a friend of mine, that the Central Bank of Rwanda became independent before the Bank of England. And the reason, together with other decisions taken by the government, was to give an early signal that macroeconomic stability cannot simply be a role of the central bank. Jean-Claude just said it. There have to be supportive fiscal policy. There have to be predictability of the entire macro framework, and not simply targeting inflation, exchange rate here and there. Because what we are living now is, maybe because there have been some good times and some shocks, we're beginning to see the divergence between this fiscal discipline, fiscal support, all right, which puts enormous pressure on central banks. So I'm saying that I'm praising the Bank of Rwanda, but I'm saying that fiscal discipline and the tough decisions taken by the government in the early years were salutary. I recall, look at this particular article in the law saying that the government of Rwanda shall limit its advances from the central bank to 11% of the previous year's revenues. I don't know, John, if it is still the same. But I tell you, I went to Parliament, defended the independence, defended the clause because I believe in it, because the government had clearly said, we shall live within our means. We have no intention of breaking the bank. Because, Jean-Claude, you are absolutely right. Central banks can only do so much. If fiscal policy does not move in the same direction, all right, there will be a lot of complications. So you said I should annoy my friend. That's what he said to me, that I should annoy them. Having said this, John, I don't know if you made the right decision to invite me. Because having said that, absolutely, that we have always to focus on macro stability, even when it is tough. Even when it is tough. Because people who suffer most from instability are those who are least able to cope with it. And the lack of predictability can be very, very damaging. Having said that, John, this is why I'm saying you may not invite me next time. This is my second point, though. African central banks cannot be the Bank of England or the Bank of Denmark. I don't have to explain this in this hall. We are different, our economies are different, and therefore we have to figure out how we balance our historical role, what the orthodox says, focus on inflation, on financial stability, and let others worry about the rest of it. I think that orthodox has two problems. One of them is that there are limits to technocracy. There are limits to technocracy. It's about people, livelihoods, families, and companies. And we have to worry about what I call the social acceptance of that narrative, that our role is price stability, financial stability, the rest is for others to look after. Because it's easy to explain to people that macro instability damages growth. Easy. But the contrary to say that macro stability will always create growth and prosperity. There is a lady in Dakar, Jean-Claude. He said in French that we can't eat GDP. All right? I think she meant we can't eat monetary policy. So this social acceptance of the narrative of our core mandate is something we have to worry about. So our banks cannot be ivory towers of this narrow macroeconomic formulation. We have to be aware of what else do we do. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm absolute believer in the fact that macro stability is fundamental. I'm only saying that once you have reasonable macro stability, you then have to worry about what matters most for our countries. And I want to put to the central bankers in this room, Mr. Bebe, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. You see, Pakistan became independent in 1947. First went to the IMF in December 1958. 70 years since independence. Has been going to the IMF since 1958 up to now. It has had 23 programs. So I keep wondering, so if you cannot have some long-term view of the macro stability of your economy, and you have to go to the emergency hospital all the time, what does it mean? Because the IMF, remember, has 3 missions, but I focus on one. It is a mission of monitoring the global economy. It's a good policy consultant, all right, a powerful one, but it's an emergency hospital. If you go there, they will fix you up. They will tell you, they give very good advice, diet, exercise, and do things, all right? But if you go home and you don't diet, you don't exercise, you'll be back to the hospital. And I'm trying to figure out how we can go to this clinic. They fix us up, give us advice, then we come and we try as much as possible to follow that advice. Because if we don't, that is not macro stability. All right? That is Pakistan. Just imagine for 70 years, 23 programs, beginning in 58, 10 years after independence, and they're still going to look for stability. So I'm saying the advice we get, our own policies which you own, we must figure out a way in which we implement them to the extent that going to look for assistance outside is a rarity. It's not everything we do all the time. So once you have reasonable macro stability, don't allow it to consume you, because our leadership, be it financial sector, must take a broad view of what matters for Africa. And I think for me, I'm now retired from public office, so I can speak my mind freely. Really what matters for me in this macroeconomic framework, Africa has to find a way to put an end to this cycle of aid and debt. That is the only way to get long-term macro stability, which will lead to economic growth and prosperity. It's not this yo-yo kind of policies we follow in many countries. So I understand that there have been shocks. But I have said to you, if there was a country which suffered a major shock to its economy, it is Rwanda in 1994. GDP was cut by half. I'm sure John will have told you. I missed the opening, John, so I don't know what he said. GDP was cut by half. Inflation was running at 64%. The central bank was in shambles, let alone the Ministry of Finance. Okay? It was a major shock, a systemic one. But the solution to it was not easy options. And the government could have taken all those easy options. But very early on, it acted on currencies, on price controls, trade restrictions. Here, the tariffs were as high as 100% on some issues. Although it dismounted, put in place the right policies, tough ones. Because when you do that, business and citizens understand that this is a government which is meaning seriously to stick to macro stability. And it makes the life easy for the central bank. So this is what I want to say. I don't know if you said I should provoke my friends.
Please go ahead.
Now, my last point, which I want to share with you, again, I don't know if it will make friends for me, is that the kind of policies which were taken by the government of Rwanda in 1994, 5, 6, 7, were not policy dictated by donors. We didn't have much donors at the time. Donors were not lining up on the doors of Rwanda. These were policies developed domestically, owned by the government. So I'm saying to you that also we need to be extremely careful. In many of our countries, I think we're still relying too much on what I call the external agent of restraint. External agent of restraint. Instead of saying, okay, what are the policies which will work for me, both in terms of timing, sequencing, phasing, which will bring lasting macro stability. So some mixture of policies you generate yourself. All right? Believe me, John, please tell me if I'm wrong. No one, no agency, no the IMF, no the World Bank, no donor, except the government of Rwanda, to give independence to the central bank. It was a domestic decision. The beauty of those kind of policies, they are lasting. I mean, I was in the treasury for some time with John. I don't recall ever calling the governor of the central bank to say, look, the government has this view or the other view. Never. It never happened. Now, once in a while I had some disagreement with them. I don't have to disclose government. But on 2 occasions I had some disagreement. On one occasion I was quite furious. But I realized the signaling power of respecting the independence of the monetary authority. So let me end by saying that even in rich countries, you have seen this backlash against central banks. There's a backlash, sometimes misinformed. They are non-accountable. Some are asleep on the wheel. They didn't see this, they didn't see the other. So these issues of how we behave as central banks in the broader context is not simply for Africa. Even in other countries, there is that view that somehow the banks have to evolve. Now let me end by a question to my friends here, though. It's something which has really worked in my mind for some time, and I don't have an answer, and I want you to help me get it. So 10 years ago, all these European commercial banks and some American commercial banks were touting Africa as a place to be because of the demography, the middle classes, uptake of digital. It's a place you can showcase your sustainability and going to net zero, that kind of stuff. But in the beginning, in 2017, there's an exodus of European banks. What is going on? They're either reducing the footprint or scaling down. And the answer they give, at least when I ask, or it is too risky, or low yielding, there's a bit of regulatory overreach. And even one of them told me, those central banks, in some of them, we see a return of fiscal dominance. And I listened to all this with a lot of disbelief. So what is it that is making these banks, you can Barclays, I think there was Standard Chartered, Societe Generale, BNP, I don't know the others. Okay, they just leave it. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It gives opportunity for our banks, especially Pan-African banks who have a digital approach to occupy the space. It might complicate your corresponding banking relationships and others. But I'm just wondering, how can these banks almost like in a heady behavior live at the same time? Might there be something to do with the Basel III regulations, which were a reaction to the global financial crisis? And so these new regulations are written to sort out the global banks. Did they take into account our African situation? I don't know. So I'm asking this question because it has exercised my mind quite a lot about what do our regulators do? What do our regulators say when we find that some global rules like these ones actually work against our interest. Now, I'm asking this question out of ignorance, pure ignorance, because I've been looking for an answer, I can't get one. And I'm hoping I can get one today. But that said, I want to clap my hands for the central bankers in this room. You do a great job. Times are now very hard. Times are very, very hard. So we need to be innovative, think broadly, think out of the box. But I'm also passing a message to fiscal authorities in our countries, to fiscal authorities, that terms of discipline build better terms for the future. And I think somewhere, maybe the last 10 years, fiscal discipline has begun to relax. For reasons I think were to do with the fact that we survived the global financial crisis undamaged, all right? And then the benign global conditions which exist at the time. But it's time to have the fiscal arm and the monetary arm working together. Everyone knowing their lanes. I'm not saying central banks, you should end up in the same room as fiscal authorities coordinating everything. You must know your lane. You must know your lane. But that also means you must coordinate. As Jean-Claude was saying exactly, what they do in UMOR. But thank you very much for the invitation, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Donald. I want to open up to a few questions from the audience. Please get ready to ask those questions. We have a microphone moving around. And as you get ready to ask those questions, I want to bring Mr. Maxwell back into the conversation. Dr. Donald talked about dieting, exercising, living within your means. And in your earlier remarks, you largely talked about the period before 2020. And we've seen the Ghana CD needing a little bit of exercise and dieting over the past few years. You're getting into another election year. How is the Central Bank of Ghana preparing for that? We had Dr. Tink say, Uganda was ready for the shocks that they got, that the world got in 2020, 2021, 2022. How is the Central Bank of Ghana preparing for this particular election year? And how is it getting ready to curb the inflation pressures? The issue of going back to IMF, not to fall into a Pakistan-like situation, especially over the past 3, 4, 5 years. Mr. Maxwell.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wasn't going to comment about going to the IMF like Pakistan, but Abebe is here, so I have to say it, right? Because Ghana has gone 18 times since 1957, right? So we're getting close to Pakistan. But back to your question. From where I ended, I talked about the fact that we have an IMF program, and unfortunately the program is working very well. In fact, what is the biggest challenge this year is that this year also happens to be an election year. And what we're trying to avoid is to have the usual election year fiscal slippage. The program has been strong. There has been fiscal consolidation up to date, so it's complementing monetary policy. And if you realize from 2022, by 2023, inflation has more than halved. And then the projection is that it's going to even go further down from 23 to 15% at the end of this year. And so far, up to June, Ghana has completed the first review. We've finished the mission for the second review, which had a staff level agreement waiting for the board to approve, and it's every indication that it will be completed. And so that is keeping the economy and the policies well aligned, well coordinated, and expected to deliver till the end of the year. The challenge will be between now and December, where the temperature of the elections are very high, but every indication so far shows that the government is committed to the fiscal consolidation. The Central Bank is committed to continuing to implement prudent monetary policies. The lessons from 2022 have been very painful, and that is guiding policies in this year going forward. we are very committed, and we think that we'll be able to deliver a year, an election year, where fiscal consolidation has stayed on track, complemented monetary policy to keep the resetting of the macroeconomy in Ghana more strongly. We did that in 2004, so it's doable. And every indication is that this is going to happen. We are seeing some challenges with the currency, which is depreciating. By the time I was leaving town, it has started appreciating again. So it's really trying to come back. And our assessment was that it wasn't really being driven by the fundamentals, but it was about some uncertainty about the conclusion of the debt restructuring, which was creating some concern that if that debt restructuring is not concluded, Ghana will have to resume to pay the external debt coupons. And if that is going to happen, it's going to put pressure on the reserves. And so agents were beginning to position. But the news that have come out is that there's been some agreement on the MOU with the OCC, which is Official Creditors Committee, and the Eurobond holders are moving to a point where they are all converging. So once we have the board meeting, we expect that that sentiment that drove the currency to move will begin to come down. We've already beginning to see that coming down. So that's what I want to say, that Ghana is actually emerging into a good place now, as from what we saw in 2022, which was really very difficult. But after I've said that, I have to associate myself with everything that my senior brother from BCIO and Kaberuka and Michael said. Really, monetary policy has to focus, but it has to be complemented by fiscal policy. Without that, monetary policy alone cannot do the work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maxwell. Do we have any questions coming in from the audience? Any questions? Please don't be shy. So Dr. Donald insists his question will be the first one from the audience, so I'll throw it to you, Dr. Ting. The question from Dr. Donald: why are European banks leaving, and the regulation policies? There were two questions, and the regulation policies in Africa vis-a-vis the ones that the global regulation policies that were put in place 08, 09, the reaction to that. More homegrown solutions, maybe?
Thank you. I would like to put that as a hypothesis, that needs to be tested. Certainly, if you look at the provisions and the Basel III, the element of risk-based kind of regulation takes precedence, and then the provision of capital based on those kinds of risks. So now, if you're going to operate in a risk environment, how much capital do you need to sustain yourself in there? And so I am therefore not sure whether the perceived risk and the additional capital that they need, and of course you have all these issues of anti-money laundering and all those kinds of things, and how safe are you with the counterparties you're dealing with in here? I mean, if you're a bank, they're talking about political exposed persons, all right? Are you going to really tell some of your customers that you're politically exposed and still remain there? So all those kinds of risks, would you want to be associated with it? And what we are seeing is that if a bank is a subsidiary here of maybe some advanced country bank, right? How can they minimize their risks in an environment that is said to be highly risky? So do you want to cut your costs well in advance, or you want to remain and see what you do to mitigate? But again, like I said, it's a hypothetical question that we need to test. But there seems to be some evidence that there's a withdrawal of some of this. But like you mentioned, the Pan-African banks seem to be filling the gap. You see the movement of South African banks in the region, West African banks in the region, and some banks, for example, in Kenya, moving to the region, right, in DRC, South Sudan, those areas that are perceived to be risky. So do these banks have the models to accommodate that risk? It's something that we need to do. I mean, you take the case of the telecom companies. How many non-African telecom companies can operate here? I think understanding the terrain that you're working in is what has made the likes of MTN conquer the whole of Africa, right? Because they know that the rate of default, right, is quite high. So you come with a prepaid a system. There you minimize all those costs. So do you have the capacity to understand the terrain and deal with the risks that are involved? Again, it's something hypothetical that I'm thinking, but I think it needs to be researched. But that's my take on it.
He seems satisfied, so I think he is satisfied. I want to bring Mr. Jean-Claude back into the conversation, and overseeing quite a few countries, but each country has its own unique challenges, right? We commonly say Africa is not a country. If you could give us an example, one or two, of which unique situations or which challenging situations that you have faced as a monetary union from individual countries, and how best you have tackled those.
Well, thank you. As I said, essentially, and it's important for me to insist on the solidarity process, because really it's a foundation. And we have, throughout the 60 years of the monetary union, 61 years practically, there has been a time countries that have faced difficulties, civil war, security, tremendous economic shock, social, political shocks. And yet, whatever happened to this country, it can continue to mobilize resources domestically and external on the foreign exchange pooling. So that's a very critical element. Today, for example, if you look at the Sahel, we have 3 countries in the Sahel that are facing tremendous security shocks. They are really fighting difficult war against terrorism. Sometimes, at the same time, facing also balance of payment shocks with drop in prices, export prices of the key commodities. But those countries can continue to mobilize domestically resources that they cannot mobilize nationally because it's not sufficient, and they still have available foreign exchange at the same rate, the same price. That's allowed them to continue to put their program, restructuring program, and finance it, and so on and so on. So there have been many cases throughout the 62 years that we have seen, different time, because the advantage is that when 1 or 2 or 3 countries are facing difficulties, the other comes in, and it can change. And that's a critical thing. But since I have the microphone, maybe on the issue of some of the major banks leaving, we are also facing that in our market. We have big banks, international banks leaving. The thing they are sometimes saying is de-risking. This is what we heard. But at the same time, we see those banks making huge profit, tremendous profit. They're having high return on equity. And you wonder why really when you are making so much profit in a situation, in a place, very high return on equity and so on, you decide to leave. The risk is not new. You've been there since independence. So you know supposedly the risk, since you are making profit. But in any case, for us what is important is that while they are leaving, and we have seen major banks leaving, the vacuum has been filled by national, regional, and continental banks. And we think it is, after all, a normal process. In the early 60s, during and after independence, the main bank, the only one were the international banks. And gradually over time, we have seen the share declining. It's a normal process. What is important for us is to make sure that the national, the regional, and the continental bank feeling continue to be strong, respect regulation. And after all, I think those new national, regional, and continental banks understand better the market and our needs. The needs for us finance the small and medium-sized enterprise. They are more ready to do that, to do the effort to finance the small, medium-sized enterprise. They are more ready and willing to look at a big share of our economic structure, the informal sector, how to capture it and bring it in the financing system. We talk about inclusion and so on. We see that really those banks are more keen in trying to address those specific issues for us, which are very, very, very important. So I think it's a normal process, but what is more important is how we address the next step. That's critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jean-Claude. Dr. Donald seems very satisfied with these two answers. But Dr. Donald, I'll give you a chance to give the closing remarks because we're time bad. And maybe throw this question also to you. What do you think and how do you think the central banks should maybe expand their roles or perform their roles differently to set that pace for the next 5 years?
Well, first of all, as a polite Rwandan, I thought it should be the guests who close the year. But since you give me the floor, and these are friends of mine, first of all, to thank them for coming and honoring our bank and our country. It's really very good, sign of solidarity. Again, I'm not saying this to flatter my friends central bankers in this room. I really think you have done very, very well, extremely well. I think the central banks are one of the least celebrated successes. We learned our lessons in the 80s. Those were very bad years. Very bad years. Lessons were learned. The right things were done. And again, the way you manage the global financial crisis, all these different issues, shows that you are doing a very good job. My appeal is simply the one I did mention. Going forward for the African countries, my hope is that one day, we can break the cycle of aid and debt. Without breaking it, it would be just like Pakistan. I'm not going to mention my friend Ghana. So we need to figure out this. What is it that makes it possible for us to break that cycle? That is a real direction to macro stability in our countries. So we need to have leadership in our banks, in our treasuries, partners, thinking about that issue. What kind of institutions? What kind of policies? I don't know if it's maybe you or one of your colleagues with whom I was discussing, just we need to think about this. I like to give the example of Vietnam. I know comparison is not reason, as the French say. But just tell me how, in the early 90s, GDP of Vietnam, Victoria, you used to be in Vietnam. Yes. So if I'm wrong, correct me. Good. So early 90s, GDP of under 16 billion, 1.6. Now GDP is close to 500 billion. And what has made the difference is not the ODA, it is not debt. It is foreign direct investment. The chances are if you're holding a Samsung, the chances are 50% it is made in Vietnam. I was chair of the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis, and I visited Vietnam. I was amazed. Not a single death from COVID. I was amazed at the improvement in human indicators. Now, they still have many challenges. Okay? By the way, do you even know, for example, that one country, which was not known in the New York or London coffee market in the 80s, now produces more coffee than all the African put together. So whether it is agricultural business, whether it is industrial production, all right? Whether it's the quality of education. There's an article in The Economist of, I think, October 2023, look it up. It's entitled, Why Are Vietnamese Schools So Good? Outcomes. Sometimes better than UK or Canada. And they link that human capital development, all right, to ensuing structural transformation and macro stability. I think that's where we need to put our focus. That is where we need to put our focus. And I know you are doing a great job. You can't do everything. But we need to have other parts of our governments and states supporting what you do to bring this to an end. The cycle of debt and aid. So this is what I want to say. But thank you very, very much for inviting me and for honoring our country. Thank you. And our bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I presume there are no questions coming in from the audience, so allow me to thank our panel of experts, starting with Dr. Donald Kaberuka. He's the chairman and managing partner, Southbridge Group. Thank you very much, Dr. Donald. Allow me to thank Mr. Jean-Claude Cassi, who is the governor of Bissau. Dr. Michael Ating Ego, who is the deputy governor of the Bank of Uganda. Thank you very much, sir. And last but not least, Mr. Maxwell Opoku Afari, the deputy governor of the Bank of Ghana. Thank you very much.